The first notice from the Riverside Heights HOA came on a Tuesday morning when the temperature was hovering around 8 degrees Fahrenheit, and I was already having the worst week of my life. I had just stepped out of my idling dump truck after letting it warm up for about 15 minutes, which any reasonable person who works construction knows is standard operating procedure when it's this cold outside. My name is Owen Ortega, and I've been running a small excavation business in northern Minnesota for the past 7 years. I bought my house in this development 3 years ago, thinking it would be a quiet place to come home to after long days of hauling dirt and gravel. The letter was stuck to my front door with what looked like about half a roll of packing tape. It was printed on official-looking letterhead with the HOA logo at the top, all fancy script and pretentious design elements that screamed, "We take ourselves way too seriously." The fine was for $500. $500 for idling my truck in my own driveway while I ran inside to grab my thermos and work gloves. I stood there in the freezing cold, my breath coming out in white clouds, reading this ridiculous letter 3 times to make sure I was understanding it correctly. According to the notice, I had violated Section 4.7 of the HOA covenants, which prohibited excessive noise and air pollution from commercial vehicles in residential areas. The letter was signed by Nancy Kellerman, HOA president, in a signature that looked like it had been practiced in front of a mirror to achieve maximum pretentiousness. I crumpled the letter in my gloved hand and went back to my truck. The engine was finally warm enough that I could drive without worrying about damaging anything. These diesel engines need time to warm up in subzero temperatures. It's not a preference, it's a mechanical necessity. I threw the notice on my passenger seat and headed to my job site, fuming the entire way. The construction site that day was a new housing development about 40 miles outside of Duluth. We were doing all the excavation work for the foundation, which meant long hours in brutal cold, operating heavy machinery, and trying to keep everything from freezing solid. My crew consisted of 3 guys: Rick, who had been with me since the beginning, and 2 newer guys, James and Carlos, who were still learning the ropes but showed promise. "You look mad," Rick said when I climbed out of my truck at the site. "HOA," I said, which was apparently all the explanation he needed. He just shook his head and handed me a cup of coffee from his thermos. "What did they get you for this time, idling my truck?" $500. Rick let out a low whistle. "That's insane. How long were you idling?" "Maybe 15 minutes. It was 8 degrees this morning. What am I supposed to do, destroy my engine?" "They don't care about that stuff," Rick said. "They just care about feeling important and having power over people." He was right, of course. This wasn't even my first run-in with the HOA. 6 months ago, they had sent me a warning letter because my truck was improperly parked in my driveway. Apparently, it was 3 inches over the invisible line that separated my driveway from my lawn. 3 inches. I had to go out with a tape measure to even confirm what they were talking about. Before that, they had complained about the color of my mailbox, which was black instead of the approved colonial bronze that every other mailbox in the neighborhood had to be. I had to repaint the thing, which cost me an afternoon and $40 in special order paint. But this was different. This wasn't about aesthetics or property lines. This was about my ability to do my job and maintain my expensive equipment. The dump truck cost me $60,000 used, and if I didn't properly maintain it, especially in these temperatures, I could be looking at thousands in repair bills. That evening, after a long day of frozen ground and mechanical issues, I drove home determined to fight this fine. I pulled into my driveway and let my truck idle for exactly 15 minutes while I sat in my kitchen with a timer, just to prove a point to myself. If Nancy Kellerman wanted to fine me for maintaining my equipment, she was going to have to work for it. The next morning, there were 2 notices on my door. Apparently, someone had been watching. Both were for $500 each. $1,000 in fines for idling my truck in my own driveway. I called the HOA office immediately. The phone rang 6 times before someone picked up. Riverside Heights Homeowners Association. This is Brenda speaking. This is Owen Ortega. I need to speak with Nancy Kellerman about these fines I've been receiving. Mrs. Kellerman is very busy. What is this regarding? It's regarding the $1,000 in fines I've received for idling my work truck in freezing temperatures on my own property. There was a pause. Hold, please. The hold music was classical, which somehow made me even angrier. After about 5 minutes, a new voice came on the line. It was sharp and nasal, exactly what I had imagined based on the signature. This is Nancy Kellerman. Mr. Ortega, I understand you're calling about your fines. Yes, I am. These fines are ridiculous. I need to idle my truck when it's below freezing. It's necessary for the equipment. Mr. Ortega, the rules are very clear. Section 4.7 prohibits excessive noise and pollution from commercial vehicles. You agreed to these covenants when you purchased your home. I didn't agree to destroy my truck. Do you have any idea how diesel engines work in cold weather? I don't need to know how they work. I need to know that you're following the rules. If you can't follow the rules, perhaps you should consider finding a different place to live or a different place to park your commercial vehicle. My hand tightened on the phone. I bought this house. I have every right to park my work vehicle here. You have the right to park it here, but not to idle it for extended periods, creating noise and air pollution that affects your neighbors. Which neighbors? Who complained? That information is confidential, but I can tell you that we've received multiple complaints over the past several weeks. From who? I'm at the end of a cul-de-sac. My nearest neighbor is 50 yards away. As I said, that information is confidential. Now, if you'd like to discuss payment arrangements for your fines, I'm happy to work with you. Otherwise, you'll need to pay in full within 30 days or face additional penalties. I'm not paying these fines. They are unreasonable. Then you'll be hearing from our attorney. Good day, Mr. Ortega. She hung up before I could respond. I stood there in my kitchen, holding my phone and shaking with anger. This was insane. This whole situation was completely insane. I spent that evening researching. I looked up everything I could find about idling laws in Minnesota, EPA regulations, and HOA enforcement powers. What I found was interesting. Minnesota did have some idling restrictions, but they mostly applied to school buses and vehicles idling near schools. There were exemptions for cold weather, mechanical necessity, and various other circumstances. The EPA also had guidelines, but again, there were numerous exemptions. The more I read, the more convinced I became that Nancy Kellerman was overstepping her authority. The HOA covenants could say whatever they wanted, but they couldn't supersede state and federal law. If there were legitimate exemptions for cold weather idling, then the HOA couldn't fine me for doing something that was legally protected. The next morning, I called the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. After being transferred 3 times, I finally got someone who seemed to know what they were talking about. So your question is about idling restrictions in cold weather? The man on the phone asked. His name was David, and he sounded young but competent. Yes. My HOA is fining me for idling my dump truck when it's below freezing. I need to let it warm up or risk damaging the engine. How long are you idling? usually 15 to 20 minutes. And what's the temperature? This week it's been in the single digits, sometimes below zero. Okay, so here's the thing. Minnesota does have idling restrictions, but there are exemptions. When the temperature is below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, vehicles are exempt from idling restrictions. That's state law. Your HOA can have their own rules, but they can't fine you for something that's legally permitted by state law. My heart started beating faster. Are you sure about that? Positive. It's in the Minnesota statutes, section 169.98. You're exempt from idling restrictions when the temperature is below 10 degrees or above 85 degrees, among other circumstances. Can I get that in writing? You can print the statute from the website. But if you need something more official, you might want to request an inspection or clarification from the EPA. They handle a lot of these kinds of disputes. The EPA, like the federal EPA. Yes, they have regional offices. You could contact them and request an inspection or opinion letter. If your HOA is trying to enforce rules that conflict with federal or state environmental regulations, the EPA might be interested. This was exactly what I needed. I thanked David profusely and immediately started looking up EPA contact information. The regional office for Minnesota was in Chicago, which made sense given the geographic regions they covered. I filled out an online form requesting an inspection and opinion letter regarding cold weather idling exemptions for commercial vehicles. In the meantime, I decided I wasn't going to stop idling my truck. It was my right, according to state law, and I wasn't going to let Nancy Kellerman and her power trip force me into bad decisions about my equipment. Sure enough, the notices kept coming. Every single day, there was a new notice on my door, $500 each. By the end of the week, I had accumulated $3,000 in fines. It was absurd. Nancy Kellerman was clearly watching my house, or she had someone else watching it for her. On Friday evening, I decided to go to the HOA meeting. They were held the first and third Friday of each month in the community center, and according to the HOA website, they were open to all homeowners. I wanted to confront Nancy face to face and make it clear that I wasn't going to back down. The community center was a bland, modern building with beige siding and large windows. Inside, about 20 people were seated in folding chairs arranged in rows facing a table at the front. Nancy Kellerman sat in the center of the table, flanked by two other board members I didn't recognize. She was exactly what I had pictured, mid-50s, blonde hair in a precise bob, wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my weekly grocery bill. She had the look of someone who had never worked a manual labor job in her life and had no respect for people who did. I took a seat in the back row. Nancy was in the middle of discussing some proposed changes to the landscaping requirements. Apparently, certain types of shrubs were no longer going to be permitted because they didn't fit the aesthetic vision for the community. After about 20 minutes of the most boring discussion I had ever heard, Nancy asked if there was any new business from the homeowners. I raised my hand. She looked at me with barely concealed disdain. Yes, Mr. Ortega. I want to discuss the fines I've been receiving for idling my truck. That's not new business. That's a compliance matter. If you want to discuss your fines, you need to schedule a private meeting with me. I think it is new business because you're fining me for something that's legally permitted by state law. I think the other homeowners should know that the HOA is trying to enforce rules that conflict with Minnesota statutes. There were murmurs from the other people in the room. Nancy's face tightened. Mr. Ortega, you agreed to the covenants when you purchased your property. Those covenants clearly state that excessive idling of commercial vehicles is prohibited. And Minnesota state Law clearly states that vehicles are exempt from idling restrictions when the temperature is below 10 degrees Fahrenheit. You can't fine me for exercising my legal rights. This isn't a debate, Mr. Ortega. If you don't like our rules, you're free to take it up with an attorney. I plan to, but I also plan to contact the EPA and have them investigate whether your enforcement actions are legal. That got everyone's attention. Nancy's face flushed slightly, but she maintained her composure. You can contact whoever you want. Our rules are valid and enforceable. Now, if there's no other new business, I'd like to move on. No one else spoke up. I sat through the rest of the meeting, listening to discussions about garbage collection schedules and holiday decoration guidelines. By the time it was over, I was more convinced than ever that this HOA was out of control. As people filed out, an older man approached me. He was probably in his 70s with white hair and a kind face. "I'm George," he said, extending his hand. "I heard what you said about the idling rules." "Owen," I said, shaking his hand. "Yeah, it's been a nightmare. I believe it. Nancy's been on a power trip ever since she became president. She fined my wife and me last year because our Christmas lights weren't the approved white lights only. We had some colored lights mixed in. $300 fine. That's insane." "It is. But here's the thing. Most people just pay the fines because they don't want the hassle. Nancy knows that. She knows she can bully people because it's easier to pay than to fight." "Well, I'm not paying. What she's doing is illegal," George smiled. "Good for you. I hope you win. Someone needs to stand up to her." We talked for a few more minutes before parting ways. As I drove home, I felt a little better knowing I wasn't the only one who had been targeted by Nancy's overzealous enforcement. The following Monday, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Is this Owen Ortega?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, this is Owen. Mr. Ortega, this is Patricia Mills from the EPA Region 5 office in Chicago. I'm calling about your request for an inspection regarding cold weather idling exemptions." My heart skipped. "Yes, thank you for calling. I wasn't sure how long it would take to hear back. We take these matters seriously, especially when there's potential conflict between local regulations and federal or state environmental law. I've reviewed your submission and I'd like to schedule a site visit and inspection. Would this Thursday work for you?" "Thursday would be perfect." "What time?" "I could be there around 10 in the morning. Can you provide your address?" I gave her all the information she needed, and we confirmed the appointment. An EPA inspector was actually coming to my house. This was really happening. I immediately called Rick to tell him I might be late to the job site on Thursday. He was excited for me. "That's great, man. You're really sticking it to them." "I just want them to leave me alone. I want to be able to do my job without some busybody fining me for basic equipment maintenance." "Well, if the EPA backs you up, Nancy's going to have to back off. She can't fight the federal government." I hoped he was right. Thursday morning arrived with temperatures at 6 degrees below zero. Perfect timing. I let my truck idle starting at 9:30, wanting to make sure it was running when Patricia Mills arrived. At exactly 10 o'clock, a white sedan with government plates pulled into my driveway. Patricia Mills was a woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore a heavy winter coat and carried a briefcase and what looked like testing equipment. "Mr. Ortega?" she asked as she approached. "That's me. Thank you so much for coming out." "Of course. This is exactly the kind of situation we need to address. Can you show me the vehicle in question and explain your typical idling pattern?" I walked her over to my dump truck, which was running and warming up nicely. The exhaust was visible in the cold air, white vapor rising into the morning sky. This is a 2018 Kenworth dump truck. It's diesel, and in these temperatures, I need to let it idle for at least 15 to 20 minutes before I can safely drive it. If I don't, I risk damaging the engine, the transmission, and various other components. Diesel engines need to reach a certain operating temperature before they can function properly. Patricia was taking notes on a tablet. And what are you using this vehicle for? I run an excavation business. I use it to haul materials to and from job sites. It's how I make my living. And the HOA is fining you for this idling. Yes, they're saying it violates their covenants about noise and air pollution. They've fined me thousands of dollars over the past few weeks. Patricia walked around the truck, taking photos and making notes. She pulled out a device that I assumed was measuring emissions or noise levels. After about 10 minutes of inspection, she turned back to me. "Mr. Ortega, based on what I'm seeing here and the temperature conditions, you're absolutely within your rights to idle this vehicle. The EPA has specific exemptions for cold weather idling, particularly for diesel commercial vehicles. When the temperature is at or below freezing, especially below 10 degrees as it is today, idling is not only permitted, but recommended to prevent equipment damage and ensure safe operation." Relief flooded through me. So the HOA can't fine me for this? No, they cannot. Federal environmental regulations supersede local covenants when there's a conflict. Your HOA cannot enforce rules that contradict federal law. I'm going to issue an official opinion letter that you can provide to your HOA. This letter will state clearly that you are exempt from idling restrictions under EPA guidelines, and that any fines issued for cold weather idling are invalid and unenforceable. Thank you. This is exactly what I needed. Patricia smiled. I'm also going to note in my report that the HOA's actions could be considered harassment, and that they may be creating a hostile environment that interferes with your ability to operate your business. If they continue to fine you after receiving this letter, you should consider filing a formal complaint with both the EPA and possibly the State Attorney General's office. She spent another 15 minutes taking measurements and photos, then packed up her equipment. Before she left, she handed me a business card. "I'll have that opinion letter to you by early next week. Email me if the HOA gives you any more trouble after they receive it." "I will. Thank you so much." As Patricia drove away, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I had official backing from a federal agency. Nancy Kellerman was going to have to back down. I let my truck continue to idle for another 5 minutes, just because I could, then headed to the job site. The whole day felt lighter. Even the cold didn't seem as brutal. The EPA letter arrived on Tuesday via certified mail. It was 3 pages long, printed on official letterhead with Patricia Mills's signature at the bottom. The language was clear and direct. Commercial diesel vehicles operating in temperatures at or below freezing were exempt from idling restrictions under federal EPA guidelines. The letter specifically referenced the Minnesota statute David had told me about and explained how federal regulations supported cold weather idling for equipment safety and proper operation. The letter also included a paragraph that made me smile. Any attempt by local organizations, including homeowners associations, to penalize residents for exercising their rights under federal environmental law may be considered harassment and could be subject to investigation and enforcement action by this office. I made 3 copies of the letter, one for my records, one to mail to the HOA, and one to take to the next HOA meeting as backup. I sent the HOA's copy via certified mail with return receipt requested, so there would be no question about whether they received it. The return receipt came back signed 2 days later. Nancy Kellerman had personally signed for it. Now I just had to wait and see what she would do. I didn't have to wait long. That Friday, I came home from work to find not a fine notice but a letter from an attorney. The law firm was called Henderson and Associates, and they were apparently representing the HOA. The letter was full of legal jargon, but the basic message was clear. The HOA was not backing down. They claimed that their covenants were valid and enforceable regardless of federal or state environmental regulations, and they were demanding payment of all outstanding fines, which now totaled $4,000. The letter also threatened to place a lien on my property if I didn't pay within 30 days. I sat at my kitchen table, reading this letter and feeling my blood pressure rise. They were actually threatening to put a lien on my house, over idling my truck, in freezing weather. When I had a federal agency backing me up, I called Patricia Mills immediately. "Mr. Ortega," she said when she answered. "How did the HOA respond to the opinion letter? They hired a lawyer and they're threatening to put a lien on my property. They're saying their covenants override federal regulations." There was a pause. They said what? That their covenants are enforceable regardless of federal or state environmental law. Mr. Ortega, that's not how this works. They can't simply ignore federal law because they have covenants. I'm going to escalate this. This is exactly the kind of overreach that requires enforcement action. What does that mean? It means I'm going to involve our legal department. The EPA takes these matters seriously. If an HOA is trying to enforce rules that directly contradict federal environmental regulations and is threatening property owners for exercising their legal rights, that's a problem. A big problem. So what should I do? First, don't pay the fines. Second, get your own attorney. You're going to need legal representation because this is clearly heading toward litigation. Third, document everything. Every fine notice, every interaction with the HOA, every time you idle your truck and what the temperature was, build a record. I've been keeping everything. Good. I'll be in touch soon. After hanging up with Patricia, I started looking for attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes. It took several calls before I found someone who seemed qualified and willing to take my case. His name was Martin Shepard, and he had been practicing HOA law for 15 years. His office was in Duluth, about an hour's drive from my house. I took a day off work to meet with him. His office was in a modern building downtown, with large windows overlooking Lake Superior. Martin was in his 50s, with graying hair and glasses, wearing a suit that looked comfortable and lived in. "Mr. Ortega," he said, shaking my hand, "tell me about your situation." I laid out everything that had happened, from the first fine to the EPA letter to the threat from the HOA's attorney. Martin listened carefully, taking notes and occasionally asking questions. When I finished, he sat back in his chair. "This is actually a pretty strong case. The HOA is clearly overreaching. When you have a federal agency issuing an opinion letter in your favor, that's significant. The fact that they're doubling down despite that letter shows either extreme arrogance or very bad legal advice. So what do we do? First, I'm going to send a response to their attorney explaining that you have no intention of paying these fines and that you are protected by federal environmental law. I'm going to include a copy of the EPA letter and relevant statutes. I'm also going to warn them that if they proceed with placing a lien on your property, you will file suit for harassment, abuse of power, and violations of your civil rights. Can we actually do that? Absolutely. HOAs have authority, but that authority isn't unlimited. They can't enforce rules that violate state or federal law, and they can't harass homeowners for exercising their legal rights. If they place a lien on your property under these circumstances, a court will almost certainly remove it and may impose sanctions on the HOA. For the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely hopeful. So we can win this. I think we have an excellent chance. But be prepared. This could take time and cost money. HOAs often have deep pockets because they're funded by all the homeowners' fees. They can afford to drag things out. How much are we talking? My retainer is $5,000. Depending on how far this goes, it could cost anywhere from that to $20,000 or $30,000 if it goes to trial. I winced. That was a lot of money, but what choice did I have? If I let the HOA win, they'd put a lien on my house and potentially force me to sell. I'd lose everything I'd worked for. Let's do it, I said. Martin smiled. Good, I'll get started right away. Over the next few weeks, the legal back and forth began. Martin sent his letter to the HOA's attorney. They responded with another letter claiming that HOA covenants were private contracts that superseded environmental regulations. Martin sent another letter explaining why that was wrong. They sent another letter doubling down on their position. Meanwhile, I kept working and kept idling my truck every morning. No more fine notices appeared on my door, which I took as a sign that they knew they were on shaky ground. Instead, the HOA seemed to be pinning all their hopes on the legal process. In early February, about 6 weeks after this whole mess started, I received notice that the HOA had indeed placed a lien on my property for unpaid fines, totaling $5,500. They had added more fines for violations I hadn't even been notified about, plus late fees and administrative costs. Martin filed suit the next day. We sued the HOA, Nancy Kellerman personally, and the law firm representing them. The lawsuit claimed harassment, abuse of power, violations of state and federal environmental law, and something called tortious interference with business operations. Martin explained that last one. By fining me for idling my truck, which I needed to do to operate my business safely, the HOA was interfering with my ability to make a living. The lawsuit also requested that the court remove the lien, void all the fines, and award damages for the stress and financial harm caused by the HOA's actions. Martin told me that damages were unlikely, but they strengthened our position and showed we weren't just rolling over. Discovery began, which meant both sides had to exchange documents and information. Martin requested all records related to the idling fines, all complaints received about my truck, all correspondence between HOA board members about my situation, and Nancy Kellerman's personal communications about the matter. What came back was fascinating. First, there had only been one complaint about my idling truck, and it had come from Nancy Kellerman herself. She lived 4 houses away from me, far enough that she couldn't possibly be bothered by the noise or exhaust from my truck. She had apparently decided on her own that my truck was a problem, and had launched this crusade without any actual complaints from affected neighbors. Second, the emails between Nancy and the other board members showed that she had been warned multiple times that her enforcement actions might be problematic. One board member, a man named Tom Richardson, had explicitly told her that she should consult with environmental authorities before issuing fines for cold weather idling. Nancy had ignored him. Third, and most damning, there were emails from Nancy to the HOA's attorney where she specifically said she wanted to make an example of me and show people that the HOA has teeth. This wasn't about protecting the neighborhood. This was about power and control. Martin was thrilled when he saw these documents. This is exactly what we needed. Nancy's own words show that this was never about legitimate covenant enforcement. This was personal. We can use this to show abuse of power and potentially argue for punitive damages. The case was scheduled for a hearing in mid-March. The HOA filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the court didn't have jurisdiction over covenant enforcement. Martin filed a response explaining why they were wrong. The judge denied the HOA's motion, which meant we were going forward. As March approached, I noticed something interesting. The HOA had become a lot quieter. No more letters, no more threats, no more harassment. I continued to idle my truck every morning, documenting the temperature and duration each time. The weather had warmed up slightly, but we still had plenty of days below 10 degrees. 2 weeks before the hearing, Martin got a call from the HOA's attorney. They wanted to settle. They're offering to remove the lien and void all the fines, Martin told me over the phone. In exchange, you agree not to seek damages and to sign a mutual non-disparagement agreement. What does that mean? It means neither side can publicly badmouth the other. You can't tell people about what happened and they can't continue their campaign against you. I don't want a gag order. What they did was wrong and people should know about it. I understand. Let me push back and see what else we can get. Martin called back the next day. They've revised their offer. They'll remove the lien, void all fines, pay your attorney's fees up to $10,000, and issue a formal apology. They're willing to drop the non-disparagement clause, but they want a statement that you won't pursue further legal action beyond this case. What about Nancy? Does she face any consequences? That's between her and the rest of the HOA board. But I did hear from a source that there's been talk of removing her as president because of how badly she's handled this situation. I thought about it. This was a good offer. I'd get everything I wanted. No lien, no fines, my legal fees covered, and an apology. Nancy would likely lose her position, which was some measure of accountability, and I'd be free to tell people what happened, to warn other homeowners about HOA overreach. Let's take it, I said. The settlement was finalized a week later. The lien was removed from my property. All fines were officially voided and expunged from HOA records. The HOA cut a check to Martin's firm for $10,000 to cover legal fees, which meant I actually got about $3,000 back since his work hadn't hit that total yet. And Nancy Kellerman issued a formal written apology on HOA letterhead, acknowledging that the fines had been improper and that my idling of a commercial vehicle in cold weather was protected by state and federal environmental law. The apology was the best part. It was clearly written by their attorney and not by Nancy herself, but it was signed by her. I made copies and kept them with all the other documents from this case. About a month after the settlement, I ran into George, the older man I'd met at the HOA meeting. He stopped me as I was getting my mail. "Owen, I heard what happened. Congratulations." "Thanks, George. It was a long fight, but it worked out." More than worked out. Nancy resigned as HOA president. She didn't want to, but the board forced her out. Too many people were angry about how she handled your situation and other issues. We've got a new president now, Susan Martinez. She's much more reasonable. That's great to hear. It is. You did the whole neighborhood a favor. Nancy needed to be stopped, and you were the one who had the guts to do it. We talked for a few more minutes before going our separate ways. As I walked back to my house, I thought about everything that had happened. It had been stressful, expensive, and frustrating, but it had been worth it. I had stood up for my rights, and I had won. The following winter was much quieter. I continued to idle my truck when necessary, and no one said a word. The new HOA president, Susan, actually stopped by one morning to introduce herself. She was in her 40s, friendly and down to earth. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what you went through with Nancy," she said. "That should never have happened. As long as you're following state and federal law, the HOA has no business interfering with how you maintain your equipment." I appreciate that. It's nice to have reasonable leadership. We're trying. A lot of people were unhappy with how things were being run. Your case kind of became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the old board. We're working on revising the covenants to make sure something like that can't happen again. That sounds great. Over the next few months, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Nancy had become something of a pariah. People who had been friendly with her before had distanced themselves once the details of my case became public. She rarely attended community events anymore, and when she did, she kept to herself. I didn't take any pleasure in her downfall. I hadn't wanted to destroy her life. I had just wanted to be left alone to do my job without harassment. But she had made choices, and those choices had consequences. My business continued to thrive. The winter had been brutal, but my truck had held up perfectly because I had been able to properly maintain it. Rick and I took on more jobs, eventually hiring 2 more crew members. The $3,000 I got back from the legal fee reimbursement went toward a down payment on a second truck, which meant we could take on even larger projects. In April, I got a surprise visit from Patricia Mills, the EPA inspector who had helped me so much. She was in the area for other inspections and wanted to stop by to see how things had turned out. "I heard you settled," she said as we sat on my front porch, watching the spring thaw turn everything muddy. "That's a good outcome." "It is. I couldn't have done it without your help." That opinion letter made all the difference. That's what we're here for. People don't always realize that federal agencies exist to protect citizens, not just to regulate them. When local authorities overstep, we can and should intervene. Have you had other cases like mine? A few. HOAs can be tricky because they do have legitimate authority, but that authority has limits. When they try to enforce rules that conflict with environmental law, worker safety regulations, or other federal statutes, they're going to lose. But most people don't fight back because it's expensive and stressful. It was definitely both of those things. But you won. And now there's precedent. If this happens to someone else in your area, they can point to your case. You've made it easier for the next person. That thought made me feel good. Maybe all the stress and expense had been worth it, not just for me, but for other people who might face similar situations. As summer arrived and the weather warmed up, I found myself appreciating my home and neighborhood more than I had in a long time. The new HOA board was reasonable and focused on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement. They organized neighborhood barbecues and fixed some drainage issues that had been plaguing several houses. It felt like a real community again, not just a collection of houses ruled by a tyrant. One Saturday in June, I was washing my truck in the driveway when a young couple walking by stopped to watch. They looked to be in their late 20s, and they were holding hands and looking at houses. "Excuse me," the woman said. "We're thinking about buying a house in this neighborhood. Do you like living here?" I thought about how to answer that. 6 months ago, I would have told them to run far away, but things had changed. "I do like it here," I said. "The neighborhood is nice, the location is convenient, and the HOA is reasonable." That last part is really important. Make sure you research the HOA thoroughly before you buy. Talk to current residents, go to a meeting if you can, read the covenants carefully. A bad HOA can make your life miserable, but a good one can actually improve your quality of life. "We heard there was some drama with the old HOA president," the man said. "There was. But she's gone now, and the new leadership is much better. Just do your homework before you commit to anything." They thanked me and continued their walk. I went back to washing my truck, thinking about my own advice. Research the HOA. If only I had done that more thoroughly before I bought my house. But then again, Nancy had only become president a few months before I moved in. The HOA had been reasonable before her. There was no way I could have predicted what would happen. In August, I got an email from Martin Shepard, my attorney. He was writing to let me know that the state attorney general's office had opened an investigation into HOA abuse in Minnesota. Apparently, my case had been one of several that had prompted them to take a closer look at how HOAs were operating and whether there needed to be more oversight. Your willingness to fight back has had ripple effects, Martin wrote. The AG's office is looking at implementing new regulations that would limit HOA enforcement powers and provide better protections for homeowners. You should be proud. I was proud, not in a boastful way, but in a quiet satisfaction that I had done the right thing and it had mattered. As fall approached and the temperatures started to drop again, I prepared for another winter of cold weather idling. But this time, I wasn't worried. I had documentation, legal precedent, and a reasonable HOA that wasn't going to harass me. I had everything I needed to do my job without fear. The first really cold day came in late October, an early cold snap that dropped temperatures into the teens. I went out to my truck at 6 in the morning, started it up, and let it idle while I went back inside for my coffee and breakfast. When I came back out 20 minutes later, the truck was warm and ready to go. No fine notices, no threatening letters, no harassment. Just me, my truck, and another day of work ahead. As I drove to the job site, watching the sun come up over the frost-covered fields, I thought about everything I had learned over the past year. I had learned about environmental law, HOA regulations, legal procedure, and my own rights as a homeowner and business owner. But more than that, I had learned that standing up to bullies, even when it's expensive and stressful, is worth it. Not just for yourself, but for everyone else they might target in the future. Nancy Kellerman had tried to use her position to control and punish me for doing something I had every right to do. She had let power go to her head and had forgotten that HOAs are supposed to serve homeowners, not rule over them. Her downfall had been swift and decisive, but it had only happened because I had been willing to fight. Would I do it all again if I had to? Absolutely. But I hoped I would never have to. I hoped that the new HOA leadership would remain reasonable and focused on genuine community improvement. I hoped that other HOAs would hear about what had happened here and think twice before harassing their residents over petty violations or made-up problems. By the time I reached the job site, the sun was fully up and my crew was already there, warming up their equipment and preparing for the day. Rick came over to my truck as I parked. "How's it going?" he asked. "Good, really good. No HOA problems, none. I don't think there will be any more." "You really showed them, man. I'm proud of you." "Thanks. It was worth the fight." We got to work, spending the day excavating a foundation for a new commercial building. It was hard, cold work, but I loved it. This was what I did. This was who I was, and no one was going to take that away from me because of some arbitrary rule that didn't even make sense. As the weeks went by, life settled into a comfortable routine. Work was steady, the weather was typical for Minnesota, and my home life was peaceful. The HOA sent out a newsletter in November, announcing that they were planning to revise the covenants over the winter and would be seeking input from all homeowners. They specifically mentioned that they wanted to make sure the rules were reasonable, enforceable, and in compliance with all applicable laws. I attended the meeting where they discussed the covenant revisions. About 40 homeowners showed up, which was apparently a record. Susan Martinez, the new HOA president, facilitated the discussion with skill and patience. When the topic of commercial vehicles came up, several people looked at me. "I think we all know that the previous rules about commercial vehicles were problematic," Susan said. "We need to have rules that balance the aesthetic concerns of the neighborhood with the practical reality that some residents need to have work vehicles. I'd like to propose that we allow commercial vehicles up to a certain size, with reasonable idling for maintenance purposes, as long as they're properly maintained and parked appropriately." There was general agreement. A few people suggested specific size limits or parking requirements, but no one suggested banning commercial vehicles or idling. The discussion was civil, reasonable, and productive. This was how an HOA was supposed to work. By December, the revised covenants were drafted and sent to all homeowners for review. The section on commercial vehicles was clear and reasonable. Vehicles under a certain gross weight were permitted, must be parked in driveways or garages, and could be idled for necessary maintenance in accordance with state and federal law. There was no mention of arbitrary time limits or blanket prohibitions. It was perfect. The revised covenants were put to a vote in January and passed with 93% approval. I voted yes, happy to be part of a community that had learned from its mistakes and moved forward. One evening in late January, as I was idling my truck before an early morning job, my neighbor from across the street, a man named Pete who I'd never really talked to before, came over. "Owen, right?" he said. "Yeah, Pete, that's me. I just wanted to say thanks for what you did last year. Nancy fined my wife and me twice for stupid stuff. We paid both times because we didn't know we could fight it. When we heard you fought back and won, we felt like idiots for not doing the same thing. You couldn't have known." The whole system was set up to make people feel like they had no choice but to comply. Still, you stood up when most people would have just paid. That took guts, and it changed things for all of us. I'm glad it worked out. We talked for a few more minutes before he headed back to his house. Interactions like that had become common over the past few months. People thanking me, people sharing their own stories of HOA harassment, people expressing relief that things had changed. It felt good to know that my fight had mattered to others. As winter deepened and the temperatures plummeted, I continued my routine of idling my truck every morning. It was such a simple thing, such a basic part of equipment maintenance, but it had become symbolic of something larger. The right to live your life and do your work without unreasonable interference from petty authorities. The EPA opinion letter remained in a frame on my office wall, right next to my business license and my contractor certifications. It was a reminder that laws exist to protect people, and that federal agencies can and will intervene when local authorities overstep. It was also a reminder that fighting back, even when it seems overwhelming, can lead to victory. In February, I got a surprising phone call from a reporter at the Duluth News-Tribune. She had heard about my case and wanted to do a story about HOA overreach and how homeowners could protect themselves. I agreed to the interview, and the resulting article ran on the front page of the local section. It detailed my experience with Nancy Kellerman and the HOA, the EPA's involvement, the legal battle, and the eventual settlement. The article also included comments from Patricia Mills about EPA regulations and from Martin Shepard about HOA law. The response was overwhelming. I got emails and phone calls from people all over the state who had their own HOA horror stories. Some had been fined for having the wrong color curtains. Others had been harassed for parking in their own driveways. One woman had been fined because her daughter's toy wagon was visible from the street. I couldn't help all of them, but I connected several with Martin Shepard, and I shared Patricia Mills's contact information with those who had environmental regulation issues. It felt good to pay forward the help I had received. By March, as spring began to arrive and the need for extensive idling decreased, I reflected on the past year. It had been one of the most stressful periods of my life, but also one of the most meaningful. I had learned to stand up for myself, to navigate complex legal and regulatory systems, and to fight for what was right even when it would have been easier to give in. My business was thriving. I had added another truck and 2 more employees. We were getting contracts from all over the region, and my reputation for reliability and professionalism was growing. None of that would have been possible if I had let the HOA destroy my equipment through improper maintenance. The neighborhood was thriving too. Under Susan's leadership, the HOA had become what it should have been all along, a group of neighbors working together to maintain and improve their community. There were still rules, of course, but they were sensible rules enforced with reason and compassion. I sometimes wondered what had happened to Nancy Kellerman. I heard through the grapevine that she and her husband were planning to move. Whether that was because of the social fallout from her actions or just a coincidence, I didn't know. I didn't take pleasure in her misfortune, but I didn't feel sorry for her either. She had made her choices, and consequences had followed. As summer approached once again, bringing warm weather and long days, I found myself grateful for everything that had happened. I was grateful for the EPA inspector who had taken my complaint seriously. I was grateful for my attorney who had fought skillfully on my behalf. I was grateful for my neighbors who had supported me. And I was grateful for my own stubbornness and refusal to back down in the face of injustice. The dump truck sat in my driveway, clean and well-maintained, ready for whatever job came next. It wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a symbol of my livelihood, my independence, and my rights as a citizen and homeowner. No HOA, no matter how petty or power-hungry, was going to take that away from me. Looking back, I realized that the whole experience, as difficult as it had been, had made me a better person. I was more confident, more knowledgeable about my rights, and more willing to help others facing similar challenges. I had learned that the system, while imperfect, could work when people were willing to engage with it properly and persistently. And every cold winter morning, when I started that truck and let it idle while the engine warmed up, I thought about Nancy Kellerman's face when she had to sign that apology letter. I thought about the EPA inspector's words, "You're absolutely within your rights." I thought about the judge denying the HOA's motion to dismiss. I thought about all the small victories that had added up to one big win. The best part was knowing that I had set a precedent. The next person in Minnesota who faced HOA harassment over cold weather idling could point to my case. They could cite the EPA opinion letter. They could show that fighting back was not only possible but necessary. I had made it a little bit easier for the next person, and that mattered more than anything else. As another year passed and another winter came, I continued to idle my truck without any problems. The new HOA covenant revisions had been in place for over a year, and they were working well. The neighborhood was peaceful, property values were stable, and people seemed generally happy. I expanded my business again, buying a 3rd truck and hiring more crew. We were doing projects all over northern Minnesota and even into Wisconsin. My reputation had grown not just as a skilled contractor, but as someone who stood up for what was right. Several clients specifically mentioned that they had hired me because they had read about my case and respected my willingness to fight. In what became an annual tradition, every January when the temperatures dropped below zero, I would take a photo of my idling truck with a thermometer showing the temperature. I would post it on social media with a caption thanking the EPA, my attorney, and everyone who had supported me. These posts always got dozens of comments from people sharing their own stories or expressing support. The story of my fight with the HOA became something of a local legend. When people talked about buying homes in HOA communities, my case would come up as a cautionary tale about the importance of reasonable leadership and the dangers of giving too much power to people like Nancy Kellerman. I never set out to be a crusader or an activist. I just wanted to do my job and maintain my equipment properly. But sometimes, standing up for something simple and practical can have far-reaching effects. By refusing to pay those fines, by getting the EPA involved, by hiring an attorney and seeing the fight through to the end, I had not only protected my own rights, but had helped protect the rights of others. The dump truck continued to run perfectly, year after year, because I had been able to maintain it properly. That was the whole point of everything I had fought for: the ability to do my job, take care of my equipment, and provide for myself without unreasonable interference. It seems like such a basic right, but it's one that HOAs around the country violate every day, counting on homeowners being too intimidated or too exhausted to fight back. I wasn't too intimidated and I wasn't too exhausted. I fought back and I won, and that made all the difference. Every cold morning, every warm engine, every successful job was a reminder that standing up to bullies, whether they're individuals or organizations, is always worth it. The stress, the expense, the uncertainty, it all faded away in the face of victory and vindication. The dump truck idled in my driveway, and no one could tell me otherwise. That was freedom, and it was worth fighting for.